Welcome once again. As I promised to deliver another lecture, here we are with it. So if you haven't subscribed, please do so. So that anytime I upload a video, you'll be the first to get it. So let's talk about integration. Let's talk about horizontal integration, vertical integration, etc. So when we say horizontal integration, what exactly do we mean? When we say horizontal integration, what do we mean? Horizontal integration is simply a situation where an entity extends its business by obtaining a larger share of its existing product market. So this is where typically an entity will acquire one or more of its competitors. It's horizontal. So it's in relation to a related competitor, a competitor who is in the same business line as you are. So with horizontal integration, an entity extends its business by obtaining a larger share of its existing product markets. Typically, an entity might acquire one or more of its competitors. So let's give ourselves an example of horizontal integration. A typical example of horizontal integration would be a situation where, let's say Microsoft acquires Apple or vice versa. These are competitors. These are in the same industry. These are related industries, related companies in the same industry, and they are into tech, basically. So if one entity extends its business by obtaining a larger share of its existing product market, and that's what we call horizontal integration. Now, what is vertical integration? With vertical integration, an entity extends its business by acquiring another entity at a different stage in the supply chain. So that's very, very important. So what do we mean by at a different stage in the supply chain? Products go through different levels in the supply chain. So in the supply chain, there's a point where manufacturing begins. There's a point where processing begins. There's a point where packaging begins. There's a point even where distribution begins. So if an entity decides to acquire a company, it can acquire a company at any of these stages, which basically are different stages in the supply chain. That's very, very important. But for you to understand this properly, you need to understand that there are basically two levels of vertical integration, number one is the forward vertical integration, which is also called downstream integration. So this is where an entity enters the product markets of its customers. They enter the product markets of their customers. So a typical example would be where a manufacturer of tires, someone who manufactures tires, might go into the production of motor cars or motorcycles. You see, these two areas are different stages within the supply chain. Someone is manufacturing tires, someone is actually in the production of motor cars or motorcycles. So this is where somebody who manufactures tires will decide that, I want to manufacture cars or I want to manufacture motorcycles. So that's a typical example of downstream integration. Then you also have backward vertical integration, which is also called upstream, right? This is where an entity enters the product market of its suppliers. So backstream, look at it in terms of it's basically two ends of the spectrum. You have suppliers here and you have customers here. With backward vertical integration, an entity enters the product market of its suppliers. In forward vertical integration, an entity enters the product market of its customers. So a typical example of backward vertical integration is an example where a shoe manufacturer might enter the market for leather production. Somebody who is manufacturing shoes now enters into, the leather production market. So you see, it's backward, it's upstream. So if you are going towards the supplier side, then you are going upstream or you are going backward. If you are going towards the customer side, then that's called forward vertical integration or downstream integration. So that's something to keep in mind. So what are the arguments for vertical integration? The reasons given for forward or vertical integration might be as follows. One thing you need to know is that backward integration gives an entity control over its source of supply. Usually, for example, if you are manufacturing shoes, you are into shoes, right? You will depend on leather from a supplier, but sometimes organizations will want to control that source of supply. And since they want to control that source of supply, they will then go ahead to engage in backward integration. Also, on the other hand, forward integration also can give an entity control over its channels of distribution. Remember, forward integration relates to the customer side of things. Sometimes organizations want to have control over their channel of distribution, so would engage in forward integration. And let's talk about another reason. Vertical integration allows an entity to extend its expertise and skills into related product markets. So it's all about extending your business, extending your company into other areas that might be useful for you as a business. That's very, very important. Very, very important. Vertical integration is all about adding value and finding ways of reducing costs. And in vertical integration, it also helps to differentiate your products, right? It also helps to position your product in a way that is attractive to the customer, So a typical example is that in backward integration, it can aid designing and making unique components. When you have control of supply, you can make unique components because you control your supply. When it comes to forward integration, it can help you sell products in a very unique environment because you have control over the channels of distribution. So you can sell products in a unique environment. So these are some of the reasons of vertical integration. Now, what are some of the arguments against it? Against vertical integration? What are some of the arguments against vertical integration? Now, let's think about it for a moment. What would be some of the arguments against vertical integration? One of the things is if you are extending into a different market or a different area, let's say somebody who manufactures shoes now wants to go into the leather production market, it requires different management skills. If a manufacturer takes over a distribution chain, for example, they need, do different skills to be able to, handle that situation, handle that market. Otherwise, the company could certainly mess up. So that's one thing that we need to be sure of, one thing that we need to literally take care of, the different management skills side of, handling vertical integration. Another thing is that when you extend yourself into other markets, it's also possible to pay less attention to your core business. So whilst you're extending yourself into other markets, you should be able to keep some focus on your core business and pay attention to what really matters. What really matters. And also vertical integration sometimes, not sometimes, but it requires the use of capital. So you want to understand whether it's a good or efficient use of your capital in that regard. Is it an efficient use of my capital? Or I could use my capital for other things rather than investing into new markets or new products or etc. Very, very important. So these are some of the arguments against vertical integration. There are a lot of arguments against this, but these are the few I want us to touch on. Now let's look at other strategic product and service development models. And I told you that we'll be delving more into strategic models. So let's look at some of them. And see exactly what they have to say. Number one is the McKinsey and GE business screen. So McKinsey is one of the top consulting firms in the world. GE is also known as General Electric, which is one of the top companies in the world as well. So they have a model called McKinsey and GE business screen. The GE business screen was developed by General Electric in conjunction with McKinsey, management consultants. And basically what it does is it tries to overcome some of the limitations of the BCG matrix, which we've talked in previous lectures. So if you haven't watched it, please take some time to go watch and understand the BCG matrix. Because what it does here is to incorporate additional factors to provide a deeper analysis of strategic business units. Very, very important. So in this case, in the case of this McKinsey and GE business screen, strategic business units are evaluated in the GE matrix using 2 dimensions. And these dimensions are market attractiveness and business position. So what is market attractiveness? Let's understand it, right? What is market? I'm sure it rings a bell. What is market attractiveness? So market attractiveness is basically, it considers the benefits that will accrue to a strategic business unit from entering or competing in a market, in a particular market. So what are the things that make a market attractive? Long-term growth is one, profitability, the demand, the pricing trends, the growth rates, product differentiation. All these things come together to make a market attractive and to make strategic business units venture into a particular market. Then the second dimension of the McKinsey and GE matrix is that it also has GE matrix or business screen is that it also has a business position component. So in the business position component, we are talking about if the strategic business unit has the necessary competencies to compete in the market in which it operates, So that's very, very important. That's very, very important. We want to understand, does this company have the necessary resources, necessary competencies to compete in this market? We would want to understand that. We want to understand that. That's very, very important. That's very, very important. So these are some of the things that this business screen model seeks to address. So number one is what? Market attractiveness. Number two is business position. Market attractiveness talks about, the factors in the market that would make a strategic business unit enter a market or compete in a market. Business position talks about the core competencies that a strategic business unit might have that will make it able to operate in a market. Very, very key. Very, very key. So there's a concept called corporate parenting that I would love for you to understand. Corporate parenting. Now think of an organization with several branches as a family, right? If you think about it that way, you understand where corporate parenting comes from. So corporate parenting refers to the relationship between the head office of an organization. So you're looking at the head. So these are like parents and its various strategic business units. It's like a parent-children or parent-child relationship. In particular, it considers how the parent company adds value to the strategic business unit. Very, very important. And one thing you need to know that the extent to which the parent company will be involved in the strategy development process will differ between organizations. Gold and Campbell identified 3 broad parenting styles when it comes to corporate parenting. It's very, very interesting. Number 1 is financial control. Number 2 is strategic planning. And number 3 is strategic control. So let's understand what this means. Financial control. This is where the parent acts on behalf of the shareholders to identify and acquire assets and businesses. So the parents will act on behalf of all the shareholders that they have to acquire businesses and assets. The parents, the same parents, will set performance standards for the strategic business units and monitors and evaluates their performance. Monitors and evaluates their performance. Very, very important. Very, very important. But it also means that the strategic business units are also given autonomy, to make decisions at their level. So that's financial control. Basically, the parent acts on behalf of the shareholders to identify and acquire assets and businesses. Then you have strategic planning. The corporate parent aims to enhance the synergies across the strategic business units. So, and this is basically achieved through central services and resources, facilitating communication and basically ensuring cooperation between the strategic business units to achieve a common purpose. So this is basically trying to make sure that there are synergies across the different strategic business units. They also have strategic control. This is where the parent deploys its own resources and competencies to the strategic business units or SBUs in order to build value. So here, the parent's own capabilities are therefore used to seize opportunities and growth. And that's what we call strategic control. The parent deploys its resources and competencies to the strategic business units or for the strategic business units in order to build value. And so you are basically taking advantage of the parent's capabilities and the parent's competencies and the parent's resources to seize opportunities and also grow as a business. So that's it about corporate parenting. Now let's move to international strategic choice. International strategic choice. Now, when it comes to international strategic choice, there are certain things that management must orient themselves with. So this is what we call management orientation. This is the way in which an organization approaches the global markets. How the organization thinks, how management thinks. That's management orientation. And how you think will determine your approach to the market. So we have what we call the EPRG framework, classifies management orientations into 4 categories, right? So that's something you need to understand. What is management orientation? Number 1 is ethnocentric. Number 2 is polycentric. Number 3 is regiocentric. Number 4 is geocentric. So what is ethnocentric? So organizations that have an ethnocentric management orientation believe that the home country is superior. Ethnocentric. So their focus is on the home country. They believe that the home country is superior. And they have these kind of features, right? They barely venture into new markets. They carry out little research when it comes to new markets. And they have this belief that once something works in the home country, that's it. It means that it will be good everywhere. And they have also this full reliance. They place this full reliance on what they know. So even if they try to seek, consider new opportunities or new areas, they will try to seek areas of familiarity and similarities with their own markets. So number 1, there's little research carried out into new markets because there's a belief that the home country is superior. Number 2, they only place reliance on what they know or what they are familiar with. So even if they are going to consider a new market, they will stick with areas where they are familiar with or areas where there are similarities with their own markets. And, basically they think that the home country is superior. Then you have the polycentric. Organizations with a polycentric management orientation consider each country in which the organization operates as unique, and therefore they believe that businesses are best run locally. So they treat every country where their product is located as very, very unique. As very, very unique. And they have the following features. Every foreign market is considered unique and distinct, and the head office will exert little control over activities in other markets. Managers of foreign subsidiaries are also given extensive decision-making flexibility or abilities when it comes to things like technology, marketing, etc. Because basically they believe that every market is different, every country is different. So they give managers who are managing foreign subsidiaries, the autonomy to be able to take certain decisions. Then we have regiocentric. What is regiocentric? What is the regiocentric management orientation? What is it all about? So when we talk about regiocentric, we are saying here that in a regiocentric market orientation, managers view the world as consisting of a distinct set of regional markets, So they see it as, like, for example, Africa, Europe, Latin America, Asia, and so on. This approach is quite similar to the polycentric approach in that it recognizes the differences between foreign markets. But the only difference here is that unlike the polycentric orientation, the regiocentric orientation recognizes that there are some similarities. There are some similarities between local and foreign markets. There are some similarities between local and foreign markets. That's very, very important to understand. Under the polycentric, it sees every market as unique. But under regiocentric, it sees certain regions like Africa, like Latin America. It sees the countries within that space, as having some similarities, which is obviously true. And they have the following features, They have the following features. Business strategy and activities are coordinated within the specific regions. So that's how they strategize. So a typical example is a Ghanaian-based subsidiary manager will be expected to align to the company's African or Pan-African business strategy, but would be unlikely to have any opportunity to coordinate activities with similar subsidiaries based in Asia or Europe. So it's regional in focus, very, very regional. That's why it's called regiocentric. It's centered on, regional efforts. Very important. They also have geocentric, right? Geocentric. And organizations with a geocentric management orientation view the world as a potential market and aim to serve it effectively. These are truly global players that are able to recognize the similarities and differences between the home country and the international market. So under geocentric, we are basically saying that the world is your stage. These are global players. For what are the features here? Geocentrism essentially combines ethnocentrism and polycentrism into a singular worldview. The global market is understood as a single market. Some companies today are geocentric. The management believes or has this orientation that, the world is a single market and you push your products to the world. There is no distinction that is made between domestic and foreign markets. And it also aims to create a global strategy that can respond completely to local needs and demands. Very, very important. Very, very important. Very, very important. So I would like to talk about some forecasting tools for strategic planning. I hope what I discussed was clear. Ethnocentric, polycentric, regiocentric, and geocentric. So we have what we call some forecasting tools for strategic planning. We have what we call trend analysis and system model. So what's this trend analysis? It's basically a quantitative forecasting method. It uses historical data to identify a trend or a pattern or predict how the pattern will be in the future based on historical information. So that's trend analysis. You are using the past to project the future. They also have system modeling, right? System modeling. A system model will have a number of input variables or factors that will affect the future income. So when you're doing system modeling, you're basically saying there are certain inputs that will drive certain output variables. So let's take an example, right? If you take poverty, what are some of the input variables that drive poverty? Maybe things like poor management of finances, things like maybe coming from a poor background. Different input variables affect the outcome of poverty. So system modeling is looking at the number of input variables that will affect the future outcome. You also have what we call the Delphi technique or the Delphi technique. It's a method of qualitative forecasting in which a consensus forecast is developed from the opinions of a number of different experts. So what happens here is that a questionnaire will be sent out to each of the experts, and their anonymous responses will be aggregated and shared with all the experts in the group. So then the experts will compare their own forecasts with those of the other experts. And then another round of questionnaires follows, and the experts continues this process a number of times. And the whole goal here is to basically refine this process until you get opinions from a number of different experts. That's very, very key. That's very, very key. So once you are doing this process, right, once the experts are able to compare their own forecast with other anonymous experts, you start another round of questionnaires, and what happens here is that each time the experts are told what their anonymous colleagues think, they are also allowed to adjust their answers in subsequent rounds. They are allowed to adjust their answers in subsequent rounds. And the process basically goes on like that until consensus is reached. So consensus will be reached over time as opinions change, because as you keep on going through the process, opinions will change, and consensus will basically be reached. So this is one thing I thought that we need to include in our conversation, in our discussion, right? This is one thing I thought that we need to include, because in your case study, you would have situations where you have to assess business strategies. It's very key, so this is what I use acronyms to remember. I call it SAF, SAF, which is suitability, acceptability, and feasibility, to assess business strategy. To assess any business strategy, you use these three core principles. Is it suitable? Is it acceptable? Is it feasible? So what does suitability mean? It simply means, does it address the strategic requirements given the situation and circumstances? Is it suitable? Then what is acceptability? Is it basically acceptable to significant stakeholders? For example, management will not regard a strategy as acceptable if the expected returns on investment are too low, or if the risks are too high. So is it acceptable? Does it address our strategic requirements in a way that is acceptable to stakeholders or significant stakeholders? Then you also have feasibility. So here we are talking about the fact that, is it practical? Is this strategy, is it practical? Is it practical? Can it be implemented successfully, or is just up in there? We don't really understand what's going on. Can it be implemented successfully? Is it feasible? Now let's talk about, I said I will talk about ethics, in the end. So let's talk about ethics and corporate social responsibility, and then we can call it a day. So let's talk about ethics. So what's our ethics? When we mention ethics, we are referring here to basically a code of behavior or that complies with the law. You know, that's business ethics. So companies basically should comply with the law, and should behave in an ethical way or ethical manner, you know. And there are different aspects to ethics. Number one is acting within the law. Number two is you act fairly towards employees. You ensure you engage in fair and honest dealings with customers and suppliers. No crookedness here and there. You show respect and concern for the community in which you operate. You show respect for human rights. All these things are aspects of ethics. And ethics it's a very, very important part of the case study. Of the case study. Another principle that is very, very crucial is corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility. So these days, people are a lot more focused on corporate social responsibility because people want to know how organizations impact the community. So corporate social responsibility is simply the responsibility that companies recognize for acting in a socially responsible way. So basically, companies act in a socially responsible way, and basically influence or impacts the community in which they live in. So CSR usually means that a company goes further than required by the law. So businesses are not only there to make profits, but what are they doing? How do they go beyond just making profits to influence or to touch the community or to do good things? So they do that. They treat employees fairly. They operate in an ethical way. They help to sustain the environment. Environmental sustainability is very, very important. Some of them, give to the community. They ensure that, they are a responsible neighbor in the community. They are a good corporate citizen. And all these things come together for a company when it comes to corporate social responsibility. So that's very, very important. You would want to have that as a business. And these days, organizations in the financial statements report on their corporate social responsibility activities and talk about how they are sustaining the environment, how they are doing amazing things in the community, etc. Just to give them a reputation for CSR or for corporate social responsibility. So this is where I'll bring today's lecture to an end. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to the channel. If you haven't, click the subscribe button, hit the notification bell so that anytime I upload a video, you'll be the first to get it. Thank you and have a good day.